Hey, you're with me? Alright, imagine this. You're playing a fresh new game from the store that you're fully immersed in and suddenly, your character falls through the map. Now that would be awful, right? Well, the truth is that for as long as video games have existed, bugs and any other unforeseen exploits always made their way into the finished product. It's kinda part of the course given how egregiously big of a task it is to make a video game, and having players discover bugs during their playtime is about as certain as the crunch time that led to those bugs in the first place. The crumbling state of AAA games makes for pretty unique experiences. While single-player games usually sleep at the fence between being extremely polished at the release and borderline not playable before the first patch, the multiplayer landscape is where the shit goes down, cause truthfully, what's good from an exploit if you can't take advantage of it? Exploits famously have always been a part of gaming. Like, the more you play the game, the more of a chance for a bug to slip through the code, or a player to slip through the map's geometry. Where the things get interesting though is when the bugs you found can grant you an actual advantage over your enemy. From favorable positioning to a war crime, there is a wide variety of dumb shit that can go sideways with the game's code. Most of it usually goes under the radar for many years, so it's even more of a treat when an exploit gets discovered. And this might be a hot take, but I'm full on pro-exploit abuse. You obviously have some of the more severe ones that do nothing but ruin the fun for everyone, but in most cases, I say have fun till it lasts. There is a weird element of freedom and excitement when it comes to utilizing exploits to your advantage, and nothing illustrates this better than, now watch this, movement. Movement in video games attracts bugs like Ultra Kill attracts video assist, by which I mean a lot of bugs. It turns out that emulating real-world physics inside of a game engine is surprisingly difficult. The way the player moves and interacts with the environment around them is very much reliant on the junky-ass physics, and so thanks to that, movement is especially prone to have some weird, unwanted but also very fun exploits to abuse. The out-of-bounds exploit is an obvious example of the shenanigans that go under the game's hood, given the fact that the player is constantly moving with some exceptions. It's extremely common to find ways of moving past the game's boundaries, whether accidentally or on purpose. And while exploring the unexplored is a fun concept on paper with at least few uses that I can think of, the sheer initial randomness of it renders the player about as good as dead the moment they step outside the playable zone. Having said that, if I were to place it on an alignment chart, I feel like chaotic neutral would fit it best. It's nothing much to write home about, cause I'm already inside of your walls. When an FPS game allows you to go fast, it's called a movement shooter. When you find a way to go even faster, that's called an 11 out of 10. When Quake first released, some time ago, it basically set the stage for the movement shooter genre as we know it. With its pacing being fast and the levels designed to keep you on your toes, a less observant player might have skipped past some of the intricacies in the midst of all the chaos. Intricacies such as rocket jumping, possibly one of the most recognizable exploits to date that single-handedly changed Quake's gameplay for the better. With the way that Quake as a game developed, it's no surprise to see an ever-growing amount of niche exploits to be found and utilized. And so, naturally, when Valve used the Quake's engine as the base for the gold source, many of those physics-based complexities carried over. Going from the first Half-Life and all of the titles that followed, Source is known to have a rather unusual history of movement-related exploits. Besides the infamous prop flying and other object-based fuckery that was a direct byproduct of the cutting-edge technology, the true game-changer that would rule the Source games for years was bunnyhopping. First discovered in Quake and unintentionally ported to the Source engine, bunnyhopping made for the staple of Source's movement exploits. The incredibly high speeds that were possible thanks to bunnyhopping resulted in an exceptionally satisfying and expressive movement mechanic that both Half-Life 1 and Counter-Strike hosted to some extent. Where the things got really interesting was with the release of Counter-Strike Source that had possibly the most robust implementation of bunnyhopping in any Counter-Strike game. This era of Counter-Strike spawned some of the most legendary players that were willing to push bunnyhopping to its fullest potential and actually make the game enjoyable for once. I really cannot overstate how much fun of a movement option bunnyhopping was, given that you learn the timings, which is even more of a shame that Valve absolutely butchered its viability in CSGO, putting less weight on the player's manual execution and more on the adroll that you take before solo queuing. Hopefully they'll bring it back at some point again, intentionally or not. Easily chaotic good. Imagine how fucking cool the game would be if it stayed. Melee combat in FPS games has always been mostly an afterthought, not requiring much thought to use and not bearing much effect on the gameplay besides being a situational alarm button. Obviously, it's hard to expect a first-person shooter to feature robust melee mechanics, but it does feel like an underappreciated aspect of the game, especially when Halo 2 coincidentally found a way of making it fun. Following a rough development of Halo 2, a rather inconspicuous bug made its way onto the shelves with it. A bug that would go down in history of Halo as the button combos. The core idea of button combos lied in animation cancelling, where you used the reload animation to cancel your melee attacks, allowing for a few very funny combos to be possible. These, as you might imagine, heavily influenced melee fights in Halo 2, with them being an actually viable and lethal strategy given that you knew how to perform them, which, you know, connect the dots. Unsurprisingly, these didn't last very long, as the divide they created between those who knew and those who didn't was quite significant, and, well, they weren't exactly intentional to begin with. And funnily enough, Halo 2 isn't the only example of missed potential when it comes to exploits players have discovered. When a game like Overwatch gets released, it's not uncommon to see exploits get discovered, patched, and new ones introduced with every new patch. It's kinda part of the nature of games as a service, where it is expected for things to break every 2 weeks, and Overwatch is no different. Back in its earlier stages, when Blizzard still gave a shit, Overwatch used to spot a wide array of really dumb glitches that would cement themselves in the community one way or another, like for example, the almost now legendary Genji sledge dash. Somewhere in 2016, between the updates, the community would discover an exploit with Genji that would allow him to basically launch himself upwards by dashing at the ledge, opening him to a whole new set of creative ways of wasting his ult. This mechanic, unintentional as it was, fit oddly well within Genji's toolkit, and was quickly adopted as another option for movement that Genji could utilize. And frankly speaking, ledge dashing for the most part was pretty much accepted by the community. Though exploit is as exploit does, when Blizzard found out that there is a skill requiring fun and expressive movement tech in their game, they subsequently patched it into oblivion, which fucking sucks. Obviously, as the fine print under this video states, developers were in their full right to patch an exploit, but it pains me to see a potentially fun addition be booted off the game just because it requires practice to use. I'm giving Genji's ledge dash a true neutral. I also hate fun in my video games. As we've seen time and time again, developers aren't the biggest fans of exploits. And I mean, no shit, they're unintended and mostly unwanted. But as I've showcased already, there were ones that managed to weasel their way in and fundamentally alter gaming's landscape. Just like rocket jumping did. I don't think I have to introduce anyone to the concept of rocket jumping. It's like the one mechanic that forever revolutionized the way we see movement in arena shooters. Which shouldn't surprise anyone. Even though it was originally an exploit of Quake's engine, it's hard to imagine how games like TF2 would look like had this exploit been banished to the shadows. Like, it simply works as a mechanic, given how intrinsically intuitive and expressive it is. It stands alone among all of the other Quake's movement junk as the one exploit that didn't get put in this Schrödinger-ass state between Discord tech and a line amongst the patch notes. And it's not even the only example. Combos in fighting games, the literal act of linking one attack into another, have also started out as an exploit, and that's like the coolest mechanic in video games. It really makes one wonder how would current day competitive scene look like had exploits such as bunnyhopping or melee combos or fucking double pump been given more space to experiment and maybe even be adopted into their respective games, but what do I know? Rocket jumping gets lawful good, a prime example of what to do with a fun exploit. A delayed game is eventually good. A rushed game is Super Smash Bros. Melee.
Oh, last second.
That kept Mango come in and put up.
That could be it. Oh my god! That game is in the.
Whoa!
Absolutely agree. Big.
Empty. That was too fast.
Older fighting games are notorious for being broken. Back in the day, you couldn't really update the game post-launch, so everything that was and wasn't in the game was here to stay. And that made the game's balance pretty much a dice roll that you had to put up with until the game's next iteration. So in most cases you were basically fucked if you didn't pick the top tier, and before the meta could properly form, another sequel was usually around the corner. And that made Melee's case also much more interesting. The thing about Melee is that it's kind of weird. You have tournament legal stages with holes in them, characters are either unfinished and or broken, and the inputs are precise, very precise. And yet, in spite of its roughness and its abusive parents, it still manages to have a thriving competitive scene that some games would kill for. Like in the modern era of fighters, where patches are not only expected but also very heavily requested, Melee has been running tournaments on the same fucking patch for at least a decade now, with the tier list still shifting somehow. It's genuinely impressive to see how rushing the game's development to meet a console release contributed to its almost infinite skill ceiling, draped from top to bottom in batshit insane exploits. Like in between the countless infinites from across the cast, the ultra-specific interactions and the most notably wave dashing that helped to shape Melee into the masterpiece we see today, Melee's potential for players' individual expression is basically boundless. And in my honest-to-god opinion, that's fucking sick. While I personally never got into playing Melee due to reasons, watching Melee content and following some of the most annoying people on Twitter just to keep up with the scene was never something I'd imagine myself doing. It's just the combo of an unfinished mess and blindly dedicated community that never truly fails to captivate how fucking cool this game really is. It's an accidental art piece made in the times gone by, and for what it's worth, I think it's the best example of how a game can handle exploits to its utmost advantage. Melee gets its own fucking chart, y'all should start taking some notes. So, with all that said, where does that leave us? Exploits have been and always will be a part of gaming, one that's very memorable and powerful at that. So, if there is any merit to take away from this video, I want it to be this. Stop being a little bitch about exploits and start having fun with them until they last. Cause you know what they say, one man's trash is another man's wave dash. Hold on, before I close the video, 2 side notes. First off, due to the nature of the video, I had to source a ton of additional footage from YouTube, Twitter and such, so every video I used will be listed in a PASTEBIN down below. Secondly, YouTube started showing ads on my videos that appear regardless if I have them set manually, so please, for the sake of your enjoyment, use adblock. If you wanna support my shit, then consider throwing me a dime on my Patreon. And that's all, thank you for watching.